So I personally am very pleased to see this as an art therapist. I'm pleased to see an art therapy book that's making these links across climate change and social action and art therapy. Um, and we have a very distinguished panel to discuss it. So we have Professor Susan Hogan, we have Gary Nash, and we have Yasmin Kapadia, who will be talking about the book. But to begin with, Jamie is going to read us some excerpts from the book. I don't know if we should wait a few more minutes if there are people still coming in. Kate, do you think most people have arrived, or shall we give it a minute or two?
I'm perfectly happy just to admit people as they arrive if you'd like to get started. I think we're coming up to 10 past, so yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Okay, well, just a bit of introduction about Dr. Jamie Bird, who is registered with the Health Professions Council as an art therapist and also holds a post as a senior lecturer and researcher at the University of Derby. He's an associate editor of the International Journal of Art Therapy and also a member of the Climate Psychology Alliance. So, Jamie, please give us some nuggets from your book.
Okay, well, thank you, Sarah. To start with, I really want to express my heartfelt gratitude to everyone who is here this evening, to Yasmin, Susan, Gary, Sarah and Kate, to the wider audience joining us, and to the Climate Psychology Alliance for hosting this event this evening. And reading back through the book now, some 8 months since I submitted the first draft, what I'm struck by is how much the notion of intuition appears within how I first framed the rationale for writing the book and how I approached the process of writing. Whilst explicit references to intuition do not appear frequently within the main body of the book, there are strong echoes of it in how I refer frequently to imagination, time, and the other than human. But where intuition emerged most was in the very process of writing. And there were moments when it did feel like the book was writing itself. There was a flow to the process of writing, and this is something I've experienced in painting and making music. It felt like an experience of being a conduit almost for something beyond and outside of myself. And some of that is just the reality of leaning into the ideas and practices of others, because it's quite an academic book in some sense. But some of it, though, is a constant consequence of me being open to the influence of intuition, and I think to the other than human. So to help set the scene for the responses and the conversation to follow, I just want to read some extracts from the preface, which I think help to explain my rationale for writing this book at this particular time. So setting out to write this book, I embarked upon it like a pilgrimage. I had a desire to be guided as much by intuition as much as I was by reason and by cognitive analysis. Like a pilgrimage, it required faith and courage to set forth and to keep stepping forwards. Like a pilgrimage, it needed to be a journey with intention. Unlike a pilgrimage, the exact location and essence of the destination would only be fully known and appreciated after the journey had come to an end, because the journey is one that needs to be open to new influences as the writing progressed. A journey that needed to be open to new characters met upon the road and of being led down unexpected pathways. Pilgrimages tend to be taken in the company of others rather than being solitary ventures. Here, my main companions were those authors and thinkers who have lent me their thoughts and ideas, and those people who have taken part in the arts-based activities that I make reference to. The process of writing is one that embodies the message of the book, which is that the arts offer a way of being present in the world at this time, and that there is a particular approach to art therapy that is able to address the needs of this time. That approach is social action art therapy, and the time is one of crisis and uncertainty. The first and primary inspiration for setting out to write this book was my own growing sense of awareness about the reality of climate change. Scientific consensus shows that climate change is happening, is caused and exacerbated by human activity, as now having a major and serious impact on all life on Earth. The precise pace and location of those changes as they will appear in the future is part of an ongoing dialogue that has, on the one hand, proponents who argue that social collapse is inevitable within several decades, and in the other, those who argue that the evidence for such a collapse is not so clear. And as will be acknowledged repeatedly throughout the book, how that collapse plays out is contingent upon existing social hierarchies and injustices. And having gone through a process of emotional shock and grief, I arrived at the point where I was able to see that a valid response to that awareness and the feelings that went with it was to make use of what knowledge and skills I had at my disposal in order to assist others as they also came to terms with climate change. The grief and the sadness was overwhelming at points, and it is still possible for me to be overwhelmed by the awareness that climate change brings. It is all too easy to move away from that awareness, whether intentionally or not, as a way of coping. But that turning away can only continue for so long before the feelings return. I'm now a little better able to stay with those feelings, to welcome them as a valid and empathic response to suffering, and to use those feelings to direct my ways and actions in an intuitive manner. Now, when starting to write this book in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic was continuing to spread globally, and the promise of a vaccine had yet to be fulfilled. The longer term implications of living with COVID-19 will continue to evolve. What is evident right now, though, is that the world has changed, or rather many people have been changed by COVID. If I start with myself, I've been forced to be still and settled in one place, and I've made connections to other people and other ideas that might otherwise have passed me by. Those people and ideas were there at my margins already, but now they have become more central, and the way that their words resonate with me have become stronger. And at the same time as the appearance of a pandemic, there has been a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, following the brutal yet tragically ordinary and nonchalant killing of George Floyd in the USA. This has led to an urgent sense of needing to better grasp the history of racism and colonialism, which in the UK has been woefully lacking in the individual consciousness of most white people, myself included, and the collective national narrative as propagated through the educational curriculum and through popular culture. Benefiting from a range of privileges that come from being a heterosexual white man, living and working within the UK, I've been challenged to uncover my own feelings of entitlement and sense of white supremacy and racism. This includes how I've been educated within a culture and nation that has chosen to simplify and obscure the historical relationship between itself and other cultures and nations. This has not been an easy process, which is as it should be, but I've been aided by others who have been willing to be allies and accomplices, especially those in the Radical Therapy Network and the Climate Psychology Alliance, as we respond together to what this time is calling us to attend to. So at the start of this pilgrimage then, my acceptance of the climate crisis was already present. COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement further revealed the reality of our vulnerability and interconnectedness as a whole species of Homo sapiens, as well as highlighting how racism distorts the interconnection and vulnerability so that some peoples are safer than others. And in considering my response as an art therapist and researcher to the various crises we face, I'm taken with the words of Timothy Morton when he states that it is very much a job of philosophers and other humanities scholars to attune themselves to the upgrading process and to help explain it. The upgrading process that Morton refers to is a shift in human awareness and being that global warming entails. Art therapy is aligned strongly with the humanities in the way that it places creativity and imagination as both a means and an end at the core of how it thinks about and responds to the human condition. The sort of upgrading that Morton suggests is now required is one that opens up the very meaning of the concepts human, nature, and world. Such a fundamental shift needs more than a cognitive level of analysis and understanding. intuition, imagination, ancient and sacred knowledge will have to be called upon as much as rationality and empiricism as we leave the benign for humans climate of the Holocene behind and enter a new realm where the straight edges of modernity and the perpetual search for profit, material growth and convenience no longer guide us. This book then brings together my experience of synthesizing social action art therapy, arts-based research methods and participatory research methods to show how art therapy can offer an effective way to work with individuals and groups who have encountered times of crisis in their lives. It focuses on 3 specific sets of experiences of crisis: asylum and refuge, domestic violence and abuse, and climate change. I argue that those moments and times of crisis are similar in terms of how they can be framed as expressions of particular features of modernity. The use of state-sanctioned violence to maintain hierarchies of power and control, and the valuing of human rationality above all other ways of knowing and being. And they are similar in how they share certain salient features. Those features include transitions between places and ways of being as a consequence of crisis, the remaking of a sense of belonging and of self after crisis, and the importance of place and objects within the creation and sustainment of that renewed sense of belonging. This last feature is of relevance where crisis disrupts both the physical and relational qualities of belonging. This includes the loss of home, loss of landscape, loss of family, and a mourning for the real and for the imagined. Ultimately, I argue that for art therapy to engage with the sorts of crises identified, it has to take account of the social and political context within which these crises emerge and that art therapists operate within. So that's taken from the preface, but I'm left with 2 kind of thoughts, 2 questions, things that are left now after the book's been written and published that are still ongoing for me and need further development. And the first is that there is the translating of many of the ideas written about into practice, and particularly how the work can be expanded to be sensitive to diverse communities, and how what emerges from that work can be employed to inform policy and actions put in place at a local governmental level. And this objective is an attempt to follow through on the practices within social ecology, an ecology that has informed much of my thinking, that are to do with the strengthening of democracy through participation. And the second thing that I continue to do is the continual exploration of the relationship between reason, imagination, and intuition, and how that relationship fits with the philosophy and practices of modernity. And from this comes the need to keep practicing ways of imagining alternative nows and possible futures, and with an emphasis on the plurality of those alternatives. So with those thoughts in mind, I'm curious now as to where the following responses come from Yasmin, Susan, Gary, the discussion we have, and the questions that come from the audience. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I'm going to introduce now Yasmin Kapadia. Yasmin is a Brighton-based integrative transpersonal counsellor and ecotherapist, and a member of the Climate Psychology Alliance group for people of colour. She has a particular interest in working with issues of difference, diversity, and social ecological injustice. So Yasmin, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction, and wonderful to hear you speak about the book, Jamie. And I just want to start off by saying well done. It's a remarkable read. I really enjoyed the journey of it. So Jamie and I have met through the Climate Psychology Alliance, and it's one of the blessings of the pandemic that we've had lots of time online to get to know one another, and I think we've met in person once. I would like to say that this invitation to join the book launch is a really big thing for me, because it kind of brings me into this world of that I wouldn't necessarily have been part of otherwise. I'm not an art therapist, and I'd like to say that this book reached me very directly. It's not a book that you know, only art therapists would understand. In fact, just on a very basic level, it helped me think about the use of arts in the therapy work that I do anyway, and certainly the use of them in collective and group work and working in various kinds of crisis. So thank you just for that. The depictions of the work that you've done were incredibly moving and poignant, I thought, and gave a really strong flavour of what's possible through art. In sort of preparing to come and speak today, I really struggled to find the words that I might need, and I had this thought that maybe if as an art therapist I'd produce something visual to do instead, or a dance, but I didn't do either of those, and I didn't prepare the words. So I'm going with intuition, in line with your own process in writing the book. I thought it might be useful to talk a little bit about our connection in the Climate Psychology Alliance and what we do there. So we've come together through a group that is really responding to some of the issues that, Jamie, you mentioned about the recognition of colonization and the links between racial and other social injustices and the climate crisis. And so the Decolonize and Anti-Racism group in the Climate Psychology Alliance is a strong group of members who are really addressing these very difficult topics. And it's hard to talk about. It's hard to talk about, especially within a diverse group. So Jamie and I have sort of met across our differences as a woman of colour, talking to a white male therapist and academic. And I think that there's something in your way of running workshops, the art workshops that I've been on, and in the book, that comes across very strongly, which is this humility and openness to facing the difficulties involved in addressing modern day racism and colonial legacies and other forms of social injustice that are so needed at this time. So yeah, I found it a very humble read, as I find my sort of interactions with you generally, Jamie. So I wanted to say something about the need for that group within the Climate Psychology Alliance, and the need for this work of decolonizing therapy in general and environmental activism, and the work of making these links that you make in this book more widely, not just within the CPA, but you know, in many places. And I can't see the participants that are here today, but my guess is that if I could see them, it would be a predominantly white group. That's going from my experience of attending therapy settings and environmental settings, and within the Climate Psychology Alliance, we formed a small group of people of colour, and that's been incredibly important. And that group, together with some of the white people within the CPA who have done really brave work around facing into racism, and the Decolonize group, I feel like have opened the door for discussions about injustices that aren't always easy to have. So there's something about the difference of different people and different groups and their experiences of crises, which I think you acknowledge really strongly in the book, Jamie, and I think you sort of say quite explicitly many times that different people, different groups will have different effects from the climate crisis, and that this work, you know, I get the impression that it can draw out those differences, rather than just kind of assuming that everybody's going to have the same response, or that all groups are going to have the same kind of feelings. And on that note, we've talked a lot about the need for working across differences in both individually and across reaching more diverse communities, and how to bridge those kind of gaps, rather than just kind of sitting in predominantly white spaces, scratching our heads, wondering why there aren't more people of colour here, or there aren't more links with other communities. And I think you've done a lot of work across different communities already in your work with asylum seekers and different groups. But yeah, I'm still with that question of how do we make those bridges? And I think that's something we could possibly talk about more a bit later. But yeah, I guess what I'd like to say is that humility again comes up as a key need in that regard, and that art lends itself, or seems to lend itself well, to attempting to do that. Yeah, I'm going to just mention one other bit from the book that for me was, it's kind of suggested, but I didn't see it explicitly written about, which was the difference for the groups that you worked with, the disenfranchised groups who were refugees, asylum seekers and migrants, or people who had experienced domestic violence and the crises that they had experienced, and then the climate crisis that was being faced by the professionals and the staff and the students at the university. And whilst the social action art therapy approaches seemed really relevant for both groups, I would be really interested in hearing more about the differences in what came out from the two groups and the two crises, or the two experiences of different kinds of crises in those different groups. Yeah, so I might just leave it there for now and look forward to hearing what Gary and Susan have to say, and to our dialogue a bit later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Right, I'm going to turn now to Gary. I'm going to introduce Gary Nash, who is the co-founder of the London Art Therapy Centre, where he's a practitioner researcher and has been providing art therapy since 2009. He runs environmental arts therapy workshops in London and is co-founder and coordinator of Environmental Arts Therapy UK. Gary is also the co-editor of Environmental Arts Therapy Wild Frontiers of the Heart, which was published by Routledge in 2020. So over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah, can I share the screen with that function, or do I need to be added?
I've added you as a co-host, so you should be able to share screen fine.
Okay.
If not, let me know.
Okay, I'll try that in a tick. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Jamie. Thank you for writing a book I find exciting and accessible. And as an art therapist and an environmental arts therapist and a teacher and a practitioner, I'd like to talk about the impact that it's had on me in my different roles. And to do that, I'm just going to show a few slides, just add a bit of colour and a bit of nature, and that beautiful cover of your book. Let me see if this comes up. Just let me know. Can you see that? Can anyone see that?
That's great.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay. There's the sky. Sky always reminds me to breathe and to open up and to allow imagination to play. So thank you for the book. It's been a joy reading it. I got a copy quite early on, a proof copy, and I've dived into it because it resonates with so much of the work I've been doing over the years. And the takeaway for me is that this book takes my work further forward. It takes the ideas that I've been struggling with forward. It gives structure and ways of thinking and working with the arts, with groups, in a very practical way. You show how the work is done. You give examples of research, art-based research. And at the back, you've got examples of how to structure a group work process using 3 different group contexts that you write about in the book. So it's really, really helpful. In the book, you describe your ongoing work as a creative arts practitioner, a researcher, and a teacher, and you demonstrate your real-life research in several local communities, including students and colleagues at Derby University. The book shows how relevant the arts are when facing uncertainty and unimaginable change. How the arts support us to find a voice and to give expression to unspeakable pain, suffering, loss, and trauma. And in the context of climate crisis and being in a current process of transition and change, you show how the arts and creativity can capture our experiences of uncertainty, ambivalence, avoidance, guilt, grief, and fear in relation to existential threats. I would like to reflect on the importance of your book to me in the work that I do as an art therapist, an environmental art therapist, a researcher, practitioner, and a teacher. As a creative arts therapist practitioner, I value self-reflection, giving space to self and others to feel into uncertainty, ambiguity, conflicting feelings, and longing. I value introspection as part of the creative cycle and experience it as a gathering of feeling and impulse. And I value the importance of allowing that energy to grow and for it to lead forwards towards creative expression as I mobilize emotion and movement and give feeling and expression through different arts media. Creative acts give expressive form to my subjective inner life, allowing internal experiences to be externalized through the arts. The power of the creative arts to hold, to contain, and to externalize human emotion through enactments and creative form is a core principle that lies at the heart of all the arts therapists. Jamie, your book supports practitioners to consider how arts expression can be extended into social action and engage in identifying social injustice and help us consider how we might use the arts to confront inaction and mobilize change. A quote from page 30, art therapists will be familiar and comfortable with self-reflection, being an essential element in creating good therapeutic relationships. What a social action approach advocates is for the widening out of that act of self-reflection so that it incorporates social and political influences. As an environmental arts therapist, I ask myself and those that I work with as colleagues, clients, peers, and students to attend to the present, to attune to the moment, and to allow nature to provide the metaphoric language that can further our personal discoveries, our creative responses, and our sense of self-expression. As an art therapist and an environmental art therapist, I also ask myself, what do the arts have to offer in the face of climate change and the social and political crisis that we're living in? As the effects of climate emergency trigger massive impacts upon energy supply, food security, migration, political anxiety, and military violence. In this book, I appreciate that Jamie has repositioned the arts, the environmental arts, and the expressive nature-based arts therapies in relation to the knowledge base or the epistemologies drawn from ecopsychology that have emerged over the past 30 years. I find this helpful that Jamie emphasizes the importance of the three areas of knowledge or epistemologies that refer to the spiritual, the sensory, and the intimate. Quote from page 40, each of the three epistemologies challenges the distinction between self and not self, between human and non-human. Each of them challenges the primacy of the dominant paradigms and epistemologies of modernity, including a challenge to what being human means. As a practitioner researcher, I value placing art at the center of art-based research. When we start with art, we allow our creative expressions to form the basis of our research methods. We show that we value what art has to contribute to shaping our research outcomes. In terms of research, Jamie identifies the witnessing element within art therapy and art-based research as deepening the participant experience within a research design built around our responses towards uncertainty, crisis, and unimaginable change. Quote from page 121, witnessing is a central component of both art therapy and to research that has an emancipatory intention. It points to the simple power of having stories and feelings seen and heard without prejudice, and to the act of witnessing being an ethical imperative within a just society. Jamie describes how the arts in research provides a space for the imagination in response to the unimaginable. He argues that it is the use of the arts and the co-production of visual response art that enables the intangible to find form and to enable imaginative narratives of hope and action to emerge. A final quote from page 42. The imagination and visionary qualities of arts-based research contributes to what Jamie believes makes it a radical and appropriate response to crisis. The specific elements of art-based research that he identifies as justifying the label radical are addressing social marginalization, the role of creative expression in co-production of knowledge, the potential transformative benefits of research participation, moving beyond words to access those epistemologies that value emotional, intuitive, imaginative, and embodied responses to research questions. As a person who has built his life around the creative arts, therapy, and education, I have found that Jamie's book joins the dots for me, showing how art-based research can be repositioned to give voice to the subjugated, the ridiculed, or the ignored. He shows how we can adapt research methods, research design, and reflective processes to validate, demonstrate, and communicate the power and value of ambiguity, affect, and complexity aroused when living within an extinction event. Thank you, Jamie. Your book gives me more than hope.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much. And there's an awful lot in there to think about and take in. but time is pressing, so I'm going to introduce Professor Susan Hogan, who is Professor of Arts and Health at the University of Derby, College of Arts, Humanities and Education. She's also a professorial fellow at the Institute of Mental Health, and her latest book is about photography in the Arts for Health series, published this year. So welcome, Susan. And
thank you. And I'm in a slightly different mood and vein to the previous speaker. I've enjoyed that though, Gary. So mine is a response and a little bit of a provocation, of course. So I'm going to look at issues of power in particular. So a useful concept that Bird identifies in chapter 1 is that of slow violence. Immediate violence, such as Putin's invasion of Ukraine, is met with an immediate response, not necessarily a strong or universal enough response, but it is immediate. Unfortunately, the incremental violence done to the planet is incremental. A forest is destroyed here, an oil spill there, an indigenous people displaced for corporate greed somewhere else. And there is a disconnectedness or a seeming disconnectedness between many, many disparate events. Bird cites Nixon, 2011, who suggests that environmental damage disproportionately affects those peoples and places least able to resist it over sustained periods of time. In some ways, I'd suggest this is illusory. Think of the most powerful nation on the planet. Many might agree that it is the United States. The majority of US citizens have toxic chemicals in their bodies due to environmental pollution and because of poor food safety standards, or have polluted water supplies, and are perhaps more adversely affected by environmental damage by many citizens in the so-called third world. Surely the States has a loud voice on the global stage. The fact is that a lack of responsibility towards the environment is part of capitalist culture that is not sufficiently questioned even by those in the most powerful nation on earth. The notion of economic growth does not take into account the catastrophic effects of global capitalism. The notion that it is small, inarticulate, marginal communities who are most negatively impacted needs to be challenged. You, dear reader, listeners, have microplastics in your body. Chapter 2 introduces the notion of art therapy for social justice as an emerging concept and term. Some might argue that social justice has been part of art therapy since its inception, perhaps since Pinel liberated inmates from their chains and shackles at the end of the 18th century and entered into well-intentioned exchanges with their delusions as an early form of drama therapy or psychodrama. Or perhaps earlier shamanic interventions should be thought of as progressive. There are different definitions of social action art therapy. Bird notes Gulab, 2005, who emphasizes a participatory collective process which is orientated towards communities naming and understanding their realities, identifying strengths and their needs towards the transformation of lives aimed at a collective and individual well-being. The notion of the individual as embedded within a wider social context, Bird identifies as crucial to Hokoi's 2007 elucidation of social art therapy. Indeed, Sanjani and Kaplan, 2012, posit social action for the benefit of society as a plausible therapeutic goal in social action therapy. Bird notes the strand of art therapy which produces reductive narratives of deviancy and normalcy embedded in an anatomized capitalism, which fails to properly acknowledge the communal and social aspects of experience, including environment. Bird suggests that social action perspective is particularly useful in thinking beyond this reductive focus on individual deviancy and disease. The expressive art therapist for social change is another development noted as moving away from an individual medical model, embraced by some art therapists and consolidated by private medicine or insurance-based provision, which requires individual diagnoses and plans of care. In chapter 3, Bird touches on modernity and industrialization. The concept of modernity is put forward as a state of perpetual revolution, progress, and crisis. Bird argues that the dominant version of modernity places individuals in their own isolated vacuums. He urges us rather to use our imaginations to find alternatives to capitalist modernity. Key concepts which might have been drawn out further are those of progress and interlinked the notion of growth as being implicitly positive. The notion of growth continues to fuel untrammeled, unregulated, uncontained, undisciplined, immoral and destructive forms of capitalist economy, which also oppress swathes of population globally. It serves as a means of not addressing fundamental issues of social concern in a meaningful way, as growth will sort out the problem. This is an anti-intellectual and fundamentally damaging position recently espoused by our new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, who promises growth, growth, growth. Returning to Bird's point that modernity creates a hierarchy of knowledge underpinned by violence and places individuals in their own isolated and anatomized vacuums, this has clear implications for our own practice and invites us to think beyond the individual psychological theories towards systems, processes, and material conditions which generate dis-ease. Chapter 4 explores Bird's interest in violence, asylum, and refuge, and thinks further about how exploitation across national borders bolsters modern capitalist economies and relies on the coercion of peoples often dominated by corporate interests. Bird reminds us that the history of art therapy is one of challenging injustice and the status quo, and that it has challenged a purely medical response to distress and offered alternatives and complementary responses to incarceration and medicalization. It is therefore appropriate today, Bird suggests, for art therapy to address social injustice and climate change head-on. In his conclusion, Bird reminds us of the power of language. He also suggests that we might usefully view the product of modernity as an attempt to bring about a world of material abundance through ongoing technological progress as a failed project. Bird uses the term co-opted, modernity co-opted by capitalism, but it is my view that rather than being co-opted, it is capitalism itself which is increasingly portrayed as the engine that will solve global problems. Whereas fundamentally, in contrast, capitalism is unthinking and driving climate change through unnecessary pollution-producing production aimed at making money. It is quality of life that needs to become our focus. And this needs to include a system which facilitates collective responsibility towards the environment. Finally, Bird worries that climate change will exacerbate authoritarianism and the hardening of national borders, rather than leading to a collectivism, which we need to envision the future based on love and care.
Thank you, Susan. having given us a very interesting and very helpful sort of summary of the chapters, the parts of the book, was there any final comment you wanted to make? I mean, we are going on to a discussion, but I just wondered if there was anything more general you wanted to say.
I was asked to pull out some themes around power, so that's what I've focused on.
Okay, thank you. We're going to now have about just under 20 minutes of a discussion between the contributors, and then there will be some time for questions from people attending. So at that point the chat will be enabled, and please put your questions in the chat. But in the meantime, make sure they don't slip past, and make a note of them. Let me just open up to all of you to start wherever you would like with picking up the themes that have been raised.
Well, I'm interested to hear Jamie's response.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's again, real heartfelt thanks for taking time to read it and digest it, and it's interesting how it has kind of impacted on each of you and kind of the things that you're interested in. And so kind of I've made some notes to kind of keep track of that. So Yasmin, that as someone who isn't an art therapist but interested in creativity and art, how you think the kind of book can be of value to think about, the role of imagination and the role of creativity to the therapies in general. It's good to hear that. I'm glad you see. Yeah, it's nice to hear that it's kind of open to kind of a wider audience. And I think that point that you raised about how do we work with across diverse communities, I think that is real. As I was saying, that's one of the kind of things I'm kind of still trying to work on. And it's interesting that the book, some of the work I was trying to do was really kind of put on hold because of COVID. So I'm kind of about a year behind. So of where I hope to be now. So we've started to kind of take some of these ideas and work where I'm based in Derby in Derbyshire to work with communities that don't normally, and I have to be really careful about it because it's easy to say, that it's hard to engage. It's not hard to engage. It's often that communities are easy to ignore, particularly at a kind of political level. And I know that from kind of where I have been kind of enabled to kind of talk to communities, but also listen to the way the councils talk about, who are they engaging with. And I know that can feel like, okay, what's that got to do with art therapy? But I've kind of tried to argue in the book is that art therapy and arts-based research is a really useful way of kind of making connections and working with people who wouldn't normally kind of want to go to a focus group, or wouldn't want to go to an assembly, or wouldn't want to fill in a survey or whatever. So creativity and imagination, because I do think every community has its creativity and has its, everybody uses music in their own way, for example. So I do think, Yasmin, that is just ongoing work that slowly I can think, it's just going to take years of kind of, I've got some networks and some connections, and it's just keep doing that, I think, really. Kind of building that trust, because it's about building trust in a relationship.
That's what I was thinking, Jamie, as I was listening to you, and from our past discussions as well, the necessity of those individual relationships with members of different communities that make inroads to being able to bring something like this or offer something like this. And the other thing that came to mind was this idea of, I don't think you talk about it so much in the book, but I think we've discussed it before, of co-production, working with members of different communities to produce the workshops or the focus groups or the research itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I found is that you've got to do it with other people in existing groups. I work quite a lot with community arts groups in Derby, because some of them have already got really well established links to kind of a wide range of communities. And And it's interesting, I work in a university, and the university is, as much as it says it wants to be very community engaged, even just geographically, it's kind of in one part of the city, whereas where the kind of communities we really need to work with are totally the other side of the city. And it's kind of even just that kind of attempt to travel across, just a kind of physicality of, okay, I'm going to have to leave the campus, I'm going to have to make that effort to do that. So it's kind of built into that structure of that kind of difference of a very academic world versus a kind of working with communities that kind of are in a different space that need to be worked with. So there's that. And yeah, Gary, what some powerful stuff you was saying there about how it kind of, it's really nice to hear you feel, I feel really inspired by the work you've done around the environmental art therapy, because I did quote that quite a bit, and some of the other stuff that's coming, and that and social action art therapy from America. I can see kind of, okay, how can we join those two things up at that particular time? So hearing you say that you feel that the book does help to perhaps move some of that thinking forward is useful.
Yeah, I find it empowering, actually. The section, chapter 2, the language, the history, the literature review, social action, art therapy, ecotherapy, and arts-based research methods. You just bring it all together in a coherent form that, as a practitioner and a researcher, it takes me further into the potential to work and to gather and to promote ideas through the use of the arts as a research means and method. And yeah, when I'm working in the woods or making art, I feel, what does this contribute? And what can this do to engage with the challenges and the changes? And just reading that chapter helps me contextualize it, helps me understand that this is a process that's ongoing. It's been ongoing for 20, 30 years. The eco-psychology ideas and theories of Rosak in 95, they're there to help us grow, to help us learn and to help us understand. And what you've done is you've brought the arts into that context very literally. We've been kind of hedging around it with environmental arts knowledge and theory building, but this just accelerates it. It brings the visual arts into the environmental arts, into the community engagement within an art-based learning and sharing and collaborating process. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I think, and I know there's a lot more work to do on this, even just kind of thinking about how I make reference to traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and it feels like, I've just kind of scratched the surface of that and being very, well, used the word that Yasmin used, been trying to have a sense of humility about that are not kind of appropriating other cultures and other histories, but certainly being open to that and what might be learned from that. So the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer from America is just absolutely, I would encourage many people, everyone to kind of read her work, just the kind of different take she has on what is the relationship between kind of reason and imagination, and the human and the other than human. And she talks about this wonderful idea about the honourable harvest, about kind of which is quite profound, because it's easy to think, particularly from particular kind of dark ecology, deep ecology, that humans and nature are in conflict. Well, her view is that no, we work in harmony. We've just like lost touch with that harmonious. For most of our history, we have worked in harmony with nature. We need each other. We've just kind of lost sight of that. So her work is like really profound, and it's okay. Well, what does that? Still trying to make sense of that. Okay, what happens if you bring that into an understanding of psychology and of art therapy? Yeah, and Susan, I think, you know, what you're saying about power and modernity is really profound, because the modernity thing, as I did write there, I've personally got an ambiguous relationship with it. As I point out, you know, there's that question. On one way, we've never been modern. We like to think we're modern, but we're not, just because you can see, you know, if modernity is all about kind of rational control and management, then in many ways we've utterly failed at that. And that promise of modernity was going to bring about abundance. So we've obviously failed at that monumentally. So it's this idea, have we ever been modern? Have we not modern enough? But I think, as you've kind of rightly highlighted, perhaps it isn't modernity, it is about just capitalism and growth, particularly material growth. But when you mentioned that, I thought about, yeah, it's also about, and again, about humility, isn't it? Is that there's a lot about kind of psychological growth, isn't there, and personal growth and individual growth, and it kind of at what point does that become self-destructive as well, and kind of where we kind of just drain ourselves just because we kind of feel we've got to grow and make a difference. And I know I've kind of slightly addressed that a little bit in this book, because one of the early workshops we did, Laura, my wife, and me, was working with just people we knew locally who were environmental activists, and we could just see they were burning themselves out just because their definition of growth was, I've got to do something, I've got to act, I've got to have the solution, I've got to give the solution. And we kind of use these workshops as a way, okay, we'll just stop, slow down, breathe. What are the feelings behind that? There's the guilt, there's the anger, there's the angst. Okay, perhaps we can just, because I feel it in myself, you know, I feel that anxiety. Right, okay, I've got to act, I've got to be the solution, I've got to grow into this, I've got to, and that in itself just needs, and I think there's something about a kind of modern mindset that we've always got to have the answers and always got to have the solutions at our fingertips, or we've got to have technology, whether that's technology of the brain or technology of objects, to kind of solve some of those problems. So, and I'm really glad, Susan, because I know I've kind of learned a lot from you about that history of art therapy, because you're right, it does have those radical roots of kind of, you know, you've gone, I think particularly about the 60s and the 70s and art therapy and the anti-psychiatry movement. So I think that is there. I think there's a lot happening in America around social justice and social action art therapy. It's just trying to, okay, bring that particularly into the UK, and just kind of magnify that and retouch some of the roots of art therapy. I think, yeah, we need to think about psychotherapy and the kind of psychoanalytic tradition, but there's also that other tradition to re-enliven. And I know, Gary, you've kind of spoken about that as well. So that's my kind of responses to what I've heard. And if anyone wants to kind of come back on any of those, my responses.
I just wanted to reflect this bit about coming from a very radically different place, as a, you know, in your foundation, and when you mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer, and these notions of self and individualist versus collectivist kind of selfhood, and you talk about I'm not sure who you quote again, but when you're talking about the people, women who've experienced domestic violence, and this question of whether they're victims or survivors, and then there's this whole idea that, well, maybe we don't look at this as a question of victims and survivors, because that's a very individualistic response, but rather, you know, through this social action art therapy research that you've done in these groups, you've reframed it as resistance. Actually, this is not about these women and their individual experiences only. It's this societal, gendered and you know, power-based problem of violence in which we're all complicit. It's called domestic violence, but it's social violence. And, you know, your kind of framing of that, I thought, reflected very much more this wider sense of self, from which all art therapy included, can take place more meaningfully, especially in these times.
Yeah, I mean that sense of, yeah, that's of community resilience as a way of moving away from violence or responding to it or minimizing it or trying to ensure that it doesn't get worse or happen. Yeah, I have seen that. Yeah, I saw that with the refugees and asylum seekers, creating that sense of community, and very much where the host community welcomed people in and they created that resilience together. Yeah, with the women I've worked with, domestic violence and abuse, yeah, they were creating this community, and that was because it was through organisations like Women's Aid that they take a very kind of communal and social approach to that. So I saw that in action. So they really work hard not to make it a kind of individual psychology issue. So you can see the same things. I slowly over time saw, yeah, the same thing applies to with the kind of slow violence or pervasive violence of climate change. Is the whatever happens, however fast or however slow or when or where, is that we do our utmost to hold together as communities, even if it's just like really, really local. Because I think, Susan alluded to it, at a national level, things are pretty kind of, I don't know, kind of just like wild, kind of to kind of make any kind of sense of. Whereas I can see locally, and I have witnessed it, we have, with local people, we try to come together and support each other, trying to do some of it emotionally, some of it practically, some of it politically, and it might make no difference whatsoever to the pace of change or what, but at least we're kind of trying to pull some of our resources together. So I think if art therapy, like many other therapies and many other practices, if it can contribute to that kind of sense of this build community, then I think that's really valuable ultimately.
Yeah, Jamie, you framed the book within the context of COVID and starting the book during that period of time. At that time, my experience is that it kind of accelerated the need to belong,
yeah,
and to be with community.
Yeah,
and I see that has continued in different areas of my life. The community is valued. The connection is valued, and so taking that forward into all the different areas that I connect with people and work within. That's, it's as though COVID's prepared us for continuing to communicate and to challenge and to be present as the climate changes.
Yeah, and I think part of that, in terms of what's seen kind of making those communities, is that also really trying to make that effort to build those bridges between different people and different communities. It goes back to what me and Yasmin was saying about the kind of effort and work you need to put into that. It's just crucial that whatever divisions and differences there are there, we try and kind of build bridges. So I used that photograph in the book of where the Derwent was flooded, and it was I couldn't get across the bridge. But oh yeah, okay, that's that was a powerful metaphor of what that's going to do and what we need to avoid. But I remember when we kind of met talking about this a little while ago, it's okay, Yasmin, you did ask that question, asked me and us to think about, well, if we all of us here today are a community, is, well, who is not here, who's not able to read the book or access to training. So we know that's a massive issue, don't we, within all therapies, of kind of some people just can't access it for various, because it doesn't feel safe place to be because of culture and history, and also just because of the financial burden of training, even buying books, etc. This book isn't open access, it's going to cost people, and just find a way of kind of cutting it up and distributing it in that way. Jamie, so that same question. Yeah, sorry, Sarah.
I just we're
running
out of time a bit, and I'd really like to give people the opportunity to ask questions. So the chat is now enabled. If you'd like to write your question in the chat, and if when we come to you, if you'd like to speak, I think we can also enable you to unmute yourself so that you could speak your question.
Yes, I've enabled that now.
Sorry, did somebody? Right, okay, thank you. So we're waiting for your questions. Nothing there yet. So let's carry on talking maybe, and hopefully some
responses or responses.
Yeah. I have a response actually. I was responding, I think, to something that Susan said, and I was just thinking. I mean, I did my art therapy training in 1979. Things have changed a lot since then. And at that time, there were a lot of therapeutic communities and art therapists involved in therapeutic communities, and there was also a sense of art therapy being a kind of quite marginal and subversive thing, and that art therapists provided in psychiatric hospitals or other settings a sense of sanctuary, of a place where people could find themselves away from the pressures of the environment, and find a sort of space of openness where they could recontact something that they'd lost. And my sense is that with the pressures of art therapy having to establish itself as something more mainstream, that quite a lot of that has got lost, and that with the advent of CBT and other kinds of therapy that have rather sort of flooded into the environment, it's been quite hard to sustain the initial ethos of art therapy. So I think a lot of what you're talking about was actually there and has sort of been a bit whittled away, and we need to get back to it. And I think it's very helpful that you've given a very clear theoretical basis for doing that, because I think we had the sense that that was what we wanted to do, but perhaps we didn't know how to define it really or describe it.
Yeah, I think that the earlier mandate was much broader. If you think of the, Edward Adamson and his idea of the sanctuary within the sanctuary, and he said even if it's only the walk through the grounds that's therapeutic for people, I want them to come. And then in the 90s, I think there was quite a narrowing of the vision of art therapy. I think of it as being a bit like a sort of one of these glasses that kind of narrow in, and then
like an hourglass.
Now it's broadening out again.
Yeah.
Well, Christine says she would like to say a few things. So Christine, I don't know, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Say a few things.
Hello. I don't know. Can you even see me? I don't know.
You can put your camera on as well if you'd like to.
Oh yeah, hello.
Hello, Christine.
I'll try and be faster so I don't take up too much. Mate, thank you so much. I've got a background in drama therapy, and I work with a community organisation in Sheffield.
Oh wow!
And I've been really struggling and grappling to feel more a part of, politically switched on therapy networks, because it feels so much like it falls between this sort of, like people have just been saying, this narrowing professional elites, and then work on more community grassroots, which I'm only able to do because I'm accepting being paid either nothing or very much less. So, that's another huge issue around community. I found in community arts, the power dynamic with who you're working with is much healthier, and the money is much less. So that, all of that in the whole structure of it. And I've also felt very isolated in terms of trying to find politically switched on, professional therapy networks. So I've scribbled down loads of things from tonight, and we'll follow it up. And I found loads of things very moving and encouraging. particularly the thing around like how to engage beyond overwhelm, because I think it is freaking overwhelming, modify my language, you know, what's going on in the world, and I'm definitely impacted by that too. So this thing about how do we engage, really engage and be able to find action and hope beyond the overwhelm. Also, there's like loads of jokes around in there about, oh, musicians never have any money. And the point I'm trying to make, probably badly, is, you know, the whole mindset around an artist's mindset, and I think it sounds cliched, but in some way there's something potentially intrinsically anti-capitalist about having a most creative soul focused to what's the freaking point in being alive. That's why I'm saying it reminds me of that joke of, you know, a musician will never have any money because they'll always go buy another mandolin, or, you know, like what actually matters to us. If what matters to us is connection and beauty, then, you know, growth, deliver. Well, you know, what we want to deliver is a bit different, isn't it? Yeah, I think that's basically what other than thank you so much. Oh yeah, and I kind of you know, I think it's always a sign of something good when it can get through Zoom, because there's something incredibly cerebral, you know, and especially as a lot of people are speaking from an academic background. So it's like, oh, here we go, you know, a load of academics on Zoom, like, and yet, because what you're saying, everybody, you know, has got heart and soul and reality in it. I always notice when it gets beyond that. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does.
And before I bugger off and let somebody else speak, is this recording available? Because I can think of other people who come to my groups and colleagues who might be interested.
I think it is, as far as I know, Kate. I think it is going to be. Is it going to be posted on the CPA website somewhere?
It will be posted on the CPA YouTube channel, and so it should be available. It'll just take us, you know, a short time just to get it up there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Are you in the CPA then, Christine?
No, but I think I would like to be.
Yeah,
welcome.
Yeah,
nice
definitely.
to have you.
Yeah, and get in touch, because I'm, you know, I'm not far from you, so I'm only about 20 miles away. So yeah,
I will. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Christine. Helena has asked if you could say more, Jamie, about the sense of belonging from page 51 as a state of becoming, and the way art therapy can help to give expression to this.
Yeah, I mean, I won't look at that page now, but I think, yeah, when I was, that goes back, yeah, working with that sense of belonging, particularly around, think about people's responses to domestic violence and abuse. There was what the arts, it was at that time that I really got a sense of art therapy and arts-based research being as much about helping people to consider the future as it was the past and the present. And that's where you could see there was this like becoming, how can I, and particularly for those women, how can I become a safe family? How can I become a safe parent? Because a lot of them were struggling with loss of access to children because of social work, prescriptions and stuff like that. So there was that real sense of becoming something different, but oftentimes that projection into the future was based upon these ideas that were from the past. That for some of the women, oh yeah, I did have a nice home, I did have a safe family, and then that went. Now I need to recover that. For some of them, it wasn't the case for all of the women. They'd have kind of difficult childhood, be difficult all through their adulthood. So it was really becoming something quite new. But for some of the women, there was that sense of a return, a becoming. So, I mean, others here would have heard me say this before, but because I've had it for years, this thought, and it felt came to me through intuition, but this idea that it's almost like the past, present, and the future are really indistinguishable on one level, because it often feels like, and I have seen it in research, where people remember the future and imagine the past, because the two things are kind of getting kind of interlinked and swapped over. So I think I don't know if that answers your question, Helena. But I think the arts give a way to do it, because you're using imagination. You kind of think, okay, not only to reimagine the past, but reimagine the future and reimagine the present. That's really important, not to just go straight to the future or just stay in the past. It is about, okay, well, what does all of that mean in the present?
I'm going to move on. We suddenly got a lot of new questions, and I think really we've only got time for one more.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to go to Sam Lofts, who has said, as part of a climate action steering group within my local area, I'm interested in how using community arts can engage with local communities, particularly those experiencing climate denial.
Yeah, hi Sam. I should be transparent. Sam is my sister. So hello, Sam. Well, I think it can be useful. The arts are a really good way of kind of engaging, and people coming together, and different ages and different cultures and different histories. But as I've kind of indicated, I think it's kind of doing that work of kind of building those bridges to those communities and identifying, okay, well, what does art mean for those communities? What is expression? Because I've got my idea of what creativity and imagination and means, but that's not always the same for everybody else. So it's trying to spend time with those communities, and that's the bit that takes the time. That's the thing where you've got to kind of go and kind of be with people and build that trust up really, really slowly, you know, because I think a lot of communities have been burnt and kind of let down, where people going in there with good intentions and then not following up. And I think, as Christine rightly identified, there is a massive power imbalance between who's got the money and who hasn't. So I know from an academic perspective, if I apply for funding, I can apply for funding for my own participation, but they're really reluctant to give any money to community arts organisations, which just feels really immoral. They're supposed to just do it out of the goodness of their heart and added value. And it's just, I refuse to engage with those research grants anymore, just because they're just unethical. So hopefully that answers your question, Sam, but we can also always communicate outside of it.
It was time for one more quick one. Helen Brooke asks, in session, should we be much more explicit of systemic breakdown? Acknowledge it when appropriate and not be afraid to acknowledge which side we're on.
I would say, yeah, I think when it feels right with the people you're working with the individuals and the groups, if that's what they're bringing, I think do that. And I mean, we know that, I mean, particularly the Climate Psychology Alliance, you know, a lot of us, you know, have, or we know people who've encountered other therapists who don't say, I don't want to talk about climate change. It's not got any relevance to your kind of psychological situation. It's, you know, let's just focus on, you know, what your anxiety and not what's causing it. So I would say, if someone's coming to you with saying, I'm anxious about climate breakdown, I'm anxious about social breakdown, yeah, then that's, you know, go with that.
Wondering, sorry, we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I was just wondering if any of the other speakers would like to make any comment in response to any of the questions.
We've got quite an interesting question in the chat from a US vegan asking, does the book talk about animal agriculture?
It doesn't, no.
Is there anything any of you would like to say in response to the questions that we've had already?
I mean, what I would say is I think Kate's going to share my contact details on a slide. So if we haven't answered your questions, email me and I'm more than happy to carry on the dialogue. You know, that's what I ultimately hope this book does, which I think anyone who writes wants, isn't it, is to carry on that dialogue. So
in terms of community building, how do we access the CPA? Is that a simple process?
Community building.
how do we access the CPA?
Yeah.
Well, there's the website.
Yeah, which Rachel has just posted into the chat.
Okay.
There is also, if you become a member, we've just started this Mighty Networks, which is, I think, going to be a very useful way of keeping in touch. And there are, lots of smaller groups within CPA of people with particular interests. So I would, heartily encourage you to look into joining. But the website is a really great resource, so have a look at that, and I think it will give a good sense. But anyway, I would like to thank Jamie, of course, and huge congratulations on writing and having this wonderful book published, and also to Susan and Gary and Yasmin for coming along and talking about it, and to everybody for coming and taking part and listening. Unfortunately, it's time for us to stop, but do continue the conversation, I hope, in some way or other. So,
pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.